of the eighth grade, and that unit is Reconstruction, right? So you ended off last year with the Civil War, and now we're starting with this new period of Reconstruction. And as we go through this topic, I want you to keep in mind this one question here: to what extent did Reconstruction transform the South and the lives of African Americans? So we're going to actually break down this whole unit into about three lessons, three different main topics. And the first one is just to get a basic understanding of what Reconstruction was. So one basic simple definition for the term: it's the period between 1865, which is the end of the Civil War, to 1877, when the United States federal government attempted to rebuild and transform the former Confederate states. This was also the process in which the U.S. readmitted these former rebellious states into the Union and allowed them to have representation in Congress and in government. Reconstruction, though, is not one simple thing. It was multiple plans that competed with each other throughout the whole period. And really, it's broken down into two categories. There's the presidential Reconstruction, and then there's congressional Reconstruction. And so this really represents a conflict that is still present in our system today, right? Of different branches of government competing with each other for influence and control. And so this was really made evident during Reconstruction when you had the executive branch, right, which is the president, competing with the legislative branch or Congress for control over how Reconstruction would happen. And so as the war was ending, as it was becoming clearer that the North was going to win the war in 1863, Lincoln proposed a plan that gave him kind of control of what would happen. And as time goes on, that changes, as we know, because Lincoln is assassinated and other people come into play. And so here's just a quick overview of the three plans that really were put forward during this time. So this is a good time maybe to stop and look at it and read through it and save this maybe for your own notes because it's a simple graphic to explain it. But I'm going to go through each of these different plans individually. So the first plan is what was called the 10% plan, and this was created by President Lincoln. He was very lenient with Reconstruction. He believed that kind of the quicker things can get done, the better it would be for the country. He also had this belief that it was constitutionally impossible for a state to secede, right? And so in reality, it wasn't the state that rebelled, it was the individuals that rebelled. And for that reason, he kind of made up this 10% plan, right? He announced his proclamation of amnesty and reconstruction, right? Amnesty meaning forgiveness and reconstruction rebuilding. Anyone who was in the Confederacy, except the top high-ranking officials like leading generals or the president of the Confederacy, and those guilty of war crimes who pledged allegiance to the Union could be forgiven, right? Be reinstated, given back power. Also, after 10% of any state's voting population from 1860 took a loyalty oath, once 10% of that population took the loyalty oath, the state would be allowed to be readmitted into the Union. And so with that rule, some states like Arkansas, Tennessee, and Louisiana quickly moved towards readmission. Right? They quickly met that threshold of 10% of the voting population taking an oath of loyalty to the federal government. Keep in mind, though, right, 10% of a voting population is very different than 10% of the total population. Right? So in 1860, who do you think could vote? Take a minute to think about that. Right? Who could vote in 1860 was largely land-owning white men, right? And so this 10% excludes all African Americans, all women, right? And then many other white men. So it's a very small number of people actually had to take this oath in the grand scheme of things in order to get readmitted. But it was one attempt to kind of do this. In Congress, right, you had this group known as the Radical Republicans, right? The Radical Republicans were of the same party as President Lincoln, but they had different plans. They were more extreme, right? They wanted more to be done for the former slaves in the Confederacy, right? And so they really wanted to fully destroy the power of these former slave owners, these plantation owners. And they wanted to give full civil rights and full citizenship to African Americans, including the right to vote, the right to be educated, all these different things they wanted African Americans to be able to experience. Their leader was a man named Thaddeus Stevens, a representative in the House of Representatives from Pennsylvania. And so their plan had a couple different components to it. And it was kind of first brought forth through what was called the Wade-Davis Bill. Keep in mind that it says bill and not the Wade-Davis law. Because in 1864, Congress believed that the Radical Republicans in Congress, I should say, believed that they were the ones who should be responsible for Reconstruction and not the president. And so they believed that not only just 10% of the population, but a majority of the 1860 voter population should take this oath. President Lincoln vetoed this bill, and they did not have enough votes to override his veto. So this bill was kind of dead on arrival, but it does show what the radical Republicans hoped for and what they would eventually get to when they became more powerful. As we know, towards the end of the Civil War, President Lincoln is assassinated in 1865. And when he is assassinated, his vice president, a man named Andrew Johnson, becomes president. Right, and so now President Johnson also had this idea of presidential reconstruction, right? That this would be the president's job to decide the criteria for letting a state back in the Union. And so he kind of focuses a little bit differently than Lincoln, is that he focuses more on the state, right? So the state had to make certain acts as a state to gain readmission. So that meant they had to withdraw their succession bills or their succession proclamations. They had to swear allegiance to the Union. And they also had to ratify the 13th Amendment, right? So not just individuals, but the state as a whole needed to do these things. The 13th Amendment is really important because the 13th Amendment is what officially bans slavery in the United States. He also wanted to have them annul Confederate war debts, making sure that the federal government was not responsible for these debts that the rebels had gained while fighting. Overall, though, it was relatively easy for states to join in, right? A minority of people still had to pledge allegiance in order for the state to become part of the Union again. And so radical Republicans were not very happy with Johnson's plan. And to make matters worse, Andrew Johnson was actually not a Republican, he was a Democrat. And during this time, the vice presidential candidate and the presidential candidate might not have been part of the same party. And so there was that extra tension between them that made the relationship even worse. It also did not provide at all for Black Americans' civil rights, right? His plan mentioned nothing about property, voting, or civil rights. And so to the radical Republicans, this did not go far enough. Right? And so throughout Johnson's plan, over 13,000 Confederate soldiers were pardoned as a result of his plan. So that's a lot of people, right? All states but Texas quickly agreed to the criteria and established new governments. So a lot of the other Confederate states jumped at the lenient opportunity of President Johnson to quickly gain readmission. Think for a minute, why do you think it's so important for these states to gain readmission into the Union? Take a minute to think about why they would want to do this quickly. The sooner these states gain their readmission, the sooner they can send representatives to the Congress, right? And the sooner they can send representatives to Congress, the quicker that the radical Republicans' power decreases and Democrats in the South can kind of have more influence over what goes on in their states, right? And on top of, even though Johnson had these criteria, there was not full compliance to these rules. So, for example, Mississippi did not officially ratify the 13th Amendment until 2013, right? That doesn't mean that they weren't following it, though, because once a majority, 3/4 of the states ratify an amendment, it becomes the law of the land. And so while they were not one of those states who did ratify it, they still had to abide by it. But it just kind of is a symbolic thing, right, that they, in 2013, finally officially ratified this as kind of a sign of racial progress. In addition, the lack of compliance, plenty of Confederate government officials were elected to Congress, and Johnson did not really say anything or object to that. So you had these people who openly rebelled against the government now getting to serve in that government. And so this led to a political showdown. Right? On the radical Republican side, they refused to allow Southern representatives to take their seats. So the members of Congress refused to let them enter into the Capitol building. Moderate Republicans, people closer to Lincoln's point of view, attempted to address some of the shortfalls here of Johnson's plan. They did that through two things. First, they established the Freedmen's Bureau through legislation, right? And this bureau, this organization, this branch of the executive branch, they were a financial assistance, a welfare assistance to a lot of the former freed slaves and poor whites who lived in the former Confederate states. They built over 40 hospitals, thousands of schools, right? They trained hundreds or thousands of teachers, right? And so they were doing a lot of important work to help make life a little more equitable for African Americans, right, by providing them with health care and with education. They also passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, and this is pretty important because it abolished black codes, which were the codes that had laws that essentially discriminated against African Americans. They couldn't do certain things. They were punished differently. They didn't have the same rights. Right? These were written into the legal systems of the Confederate States, and so the Civil Rights Act actually abolished that, and it gave African Americans citizenship. Right? And so one important thing that comes with citizenship would be the right to vote. However, President Johnson, using his veto power, vetoed both of these bills at first, right? And this infuriated Congress and the radical Republicans, and they actually were able to override President Johnson's veto, right? So when 2/3 of both houses of Congress vote to override a veto, then that's when it happens, right? So it takes a lot of people, a lot of support for a veto to be overridden. And so actually, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 was the first law to ever pass over a presidential veto. So it's pretty historic. And so this shows kind of a shift in power from the presidential to congressional Reconstruction. At this point, Congress now has control because they have a 2/3 majority. They can pass the laws despite President Johnson's reluctance to pass them. And so they do more with this as well. So that Civil Rights Act does become law, and so does the Freedmen's Bureau. And they do a lot of good work to protect and promote the well-being of African Americans in the South. They also draft the 14th Amendment, which is eventually, a few years later, ratified by the states, again, 3/4 of the states. And that kind of lays a constitutional framework, I should say, for the protection of African American civil rights. And we'll get more into each of these amendments that come up later. In 1866, the Republicans won even more seats in Congress. Now they have a 2/3 majority in Congress, and they have complete control, pretty much. Right? A 2/3 majority means, again, if a president vetoes something, they can override it. And so now they have a lot of power, and they can go forward with congressional Reconstruction. Right? And so they do that with the passage of the Reconstruction Act of 1867. Right? And this was very strict. Right? Any state, meaning the Confederate States, that did not ratify the 14th Amendment could not be readmitted to the Union. It also divided the former Confederate States into military districts, right? And so there's actually a very strong military presence in these Confederate States during Reconstruction. Take a minute or two to think about why you think there would be the need for military districts in the Confederate States. You can pause the video and hit play when you're ready to resume. So these soldiers, the army was there to protect African Americans, right? So just because a law is passed doesn't mean it's automatically going to happen, right? It needs to be enforced. And so having the military presence there helps enforce these things, right? It allows, for example, they protect African Americans while they're going to vote, right? Or if the African Americans have a complaint about how they're being treated, right, they have someone to go to besides the state government, which doesn't really want to give them their rights, right? And so it helps them in that way. So these military districts are actually pretty important. Also, all the states in the former Confederacy have to have new constitutional conventions, and in these conventions, to form new state governments, African Americans are elected delegates as well. So black people in the South during this time actually do have representation and some influence in the framing of these new constitutions, which is something you might not think about, right? If you look briefly or quickly over the history of civil rights in our country. So here's an image just showing you these different districts. Military districts. You have Virginia was its own district, and North Carolina, South Carolina as another, Georgia, Alabama, and Florida as a third, Mississippi and Arkansas as a fourth, and then Louisiana and Texas. Right? Tennessee, which was a state that seceded, had by this point been fully kind of readmitted into the Union and supportive of it, and so they did not have this military occupation. Right? And so something that might sound familiar to us because it just happened recently in our own history is President Johnson is impeached. He's the first president to be impeached. And so hopefully you're a little bit familiar with this process since it was just in the news recently with ourselves and President Trump. And when he vetoed the Reconstruction Act of 1867, which again, Congress overrode that veto, they decided to impeach President Johnson, right? They believed that he was violating certain provisions of a law that was passed, that was meant to enforce this Reconstruction Act, And so he was impeached, right? So it was sent. Only the House of Representatives can vote to impeach a president, right? And so he was impeached by the House of Representatives. And once someone's impeached, they then move. The trial occurs in the Senate, right? So the senators are the ones who listen to the arguments in the trial and vote on whether or not the person should be convicted, right? And once they're convicted, that means they're out of office. So being impeached doesn't kick you out of office. Being impeached and then convicted kicks you out of office. And the closest it's ever come to actual impeachment and conviction was with President Johnson. They were one vote short of convicting him of the crimes that he was accused of and from getting him out of office. But he was one vote short, and so he did not actually lose his position. Right? But the next year was an election year, which again sounds familiar to what happened with President Trump. Right? He was impeached the year before an election. Interesting parallels there. The Democrats decided that Andrew Johnson would be an impossible choice to actually ever win again, so they did not renominate him. They chose someone else. And Republicans nominated a man named Ulysses S. Grant, who was a general in the Civil War, and he quickly and easily wins the election for the Republicans. And it's under his term, and again with the radical Republicans, that the 15th Amendment is ratified. And so what we're actually going to spend today in class doing now is looking at and analyzing these Reconstruction amendments to the Constitution, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and looking at kind of what they did, how they were effective right away, and kind of talking about and discussing some of those things.